I am TV, assigned to assist the Earth delegation for the duration of the conclave. Vaughn smiled at TV, and it was a real smile, warm and direct, not the polished diplomatic kind. Thank you, TV. How long have you been working on this station? TV paused, clearly not used to arriving delegates asking him personal questions. For years, Commander. Do you like it here? Vaughn asked, still smiling. Yes, I do. It is a good post, TV said, blinking his silver eyes twice. Vaughn nodded and made a small note in his notebook. TV watched this with quiet curiosity but said nothing and led the commander toward the main corridors of the station. The interstellar conclave of Narveth was the most important diplomatic gathering in the known galaxy. 47 intelligent species sent their most powerful representatives here every 3 years to negotiate resource treaties, settle territorial disputes, and make decisions that shape the lives of billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. Humanity had been granted observer status 8 months ago, the lowest rank available at the conclave, which meant that Commander Elias Vaughn could enter the chamber, take his assigned seat, and watch everything that happened, but he could not speak on the floor, could not vote, and could not formally challenge any decision that was made. It was, in the quiet language of galactic diplomacy, the seat given to species that were tolerated rather than respected, the seat that said, politely and firmly, that humanity was not yet worth taking seriously. The main chamber of the conclave was circular and rose 6 full stories from floor to ceiling. Its walls curved inward overhead like the inside of a great shell, and it was lined with rows of curved desks arranged in wide rings spreading outward from the center podium. The inner rings belonged to the most powerful species, the ones with deep space fleets, with resource colonies on dozens of worlds, with centuries of political experience and the full weight of history behind every word they spoke, and the outer rings held everyone else in descending order of importance. Vaughn's assigned seat was in the very last row of the outermost ring, as far from the center as a person could sit and still technically be inside the chamber. He found it without any complaint, settled into the seat, opened his notebook to a fresh page, and began to write. The chamber filled steadily over the next hour. Delegates of every shape, size, and color arrived and took their places, greeting one another in quiet voices, exchanging data tablets, sharing knowing looks with old political allies, and almost none of them paid the human in the outer ring even a single glance. Almost none. High Envoy Sareth Vane of the Velocian Empire entered the chamber the way a storm arrives. You felt the shift in the air before you actually saw the cause of it. She was tall, even by the standards of her own species. Her skin was a deep silver-violet color, her eyes were pale gold like the edge of a dying star, and she moved through the chamber with the unhurried ease of someone who had never once in her life doubted that every room she entered belonged to her. The Velocian Empire controlled 11 star systems and had been the dominant force in conclave politics for over 3 centuries. Sareth Vane had personally negotiated 42 major treaties, had ended 2 interstellar wars through pure political skill, and was broadly considered to be the sharpest and most dangerous mind present at any table she chose to sit at. She crossed the chamber floor and took her seat at the innermost ring, pausing along the way to exchange a few quiet words with 2 other senior delegates, and then, just as she was settling in, her pale gold eyes swept across the room in a long practice sweep. They landed on Elias Vaughn. She stared at him for a moment, this plain and quiet human sitting alone in the outer ring, writing in a small paper notebook with a plain pen, and something moved through her expression like a cloud crossing a clear sky. It started as simple curiosity, then shifted into amusement, and then sharpened into the kind of amusement that has an edge to it, the kind that wants an audience. She did not bother to lower her voice. She raised it instead, just slightly, just enough that the delegates seated near her could hear every single word. "Is the human writing things down?" she said. Her tone was bright and theatrical, like someone pointing out a child who had done something unintentionally amusing. "By hand? On paper?" The laughter started near her and spread outward through the chamber. Different species laughed in different ways. The Dreth clicked low in their throats, the Eurelians let out short, sharp whistles, the Mavari shook their wide heads with broad grins, but the meaning behind all of it was exactly the same. The human was behind. The human was small. The human did not belong in this room. Vaughn looked up from his notebook. He looked straight at Sareth Vane, and the 2 of them held eye contact across the full width of the chamber for one long quiet moment. Then he gave her a single slow nod, polite, unbothered, the kind of nod a person gives when they have already decided something is not worth a reaction, and he looked back down at his notebook and kept writing. This made several of them laugh harder. The calmness of it seemed to be funnier to them than anger would have been, and Sareth Vane turned away with a thin smile, already moving on to things she considered more worth her attention. Near the chamber entrance, TV stood with the other junior aides and watched all of it unfold. And TV noticed something that none of the laughing delegates had thought to notice. The human's hand had never stopped moving. Not when the laughter started, not when it spread, not when it filled the entire chamber from the inner ring all the way to the outer walls. He had simply kept writing, steady and quiet and completely, utterly calm, as though the laughter were just another piece of information he had chosen to record. TV stared at the small notebook from across the room and felt something strange and hard to name settle quietly in his chest, a sense, quiet but insistent, that the people laughing in this room had just made a mistake they did not yet know how to measure. The next morning Vaughn arrived at the conclave chamber before almost anyone else. He sat in his outer ring seat with his notebook open and a plain cup of something warm in one hand, watching the station staff clean and prepare the room for the day's sessions. TV arrived early too, as was his habit, and found the commander already there. "You are here very early, Commander," TV said, adjusting the stack of data tablets under his arm. "I like the room when it is quiet," Vaughn said. "It shows you what it actually looks like before everyone arrives and changes it." TV thought about this for a moment and then sat down in a nearby aide's chair, which was technically not permitted during session hours but was perfectly fine now, and the two of them sat in comfortable silence for a while as the room slowly filled with light and the sound of the station waking up around them. The first 3 days of the conclave were given to what was called the preliminary round, a long and often slow series of procedural motions, formal greetings between senior delegates, and the official recording of each species' stated interests before the real negotiations began. For most delegates, this was a time to be seen and to see, to shake the right hands, or claws, or tendrils, to be photographed with important allies and to be very deliberately absent from photographs with others. For Vaughn, it was something else entirely. He moved through the social corridors and dining halls of the station during the breaks between sessions, always with his notebook, always with the same quiet expression, and he talked to people. Not the senior delegates, not the powerful ones with large staffs and full schedules and the permanent air of people who are always needed somewhere else. He talked to the others. He talked to Maravel, the junior trade representative from Ascend Collective, a small and quiet species with no military strength and minimal resource holdings whose home system sat inconveniently close to contested space. He spent 40 minutes asking her about Sen agriculture and the way her people measured seasons on a planet with 2 suns. He talked to Old Grath of the Heaven Compact, a slow-moving, stone-colored creature who had attended 12 consecutive conclaves and been passed over and overlooked at every single one of them, and he asked Grath which session he remembered most clearly and why. He talked to young Lissaven of the Orith Federation. She was attending her first conclave and was visibly overwhelmed by the size and the noise and the speed of everything around her, and Vaughn told her that the first time he had walked into a room where everyone seemed to know something he did not, he had simply found the person who looked the least comfortable and introduced himself. "Did it work?" Lissaven asked. "You are talking to me right now, are you not?" Vaughn said, and she laughed, a surprised and completely genuine sound that made 2 nearby delegates look over in mild curiosity. He wrote in his notebook during and after every conversation, small, quick notes in plain clear letters, and when people asked him what he was writing he always gave the same simple answer, just things worth remembering. Meanwhile, on the other side of the station's social world, Sareth Vane was doing what she had done at every conclave for the past 30 years. She was building, checking, and reinforcing her political structure with a precise and careful focus of an engineer maintaining a critical bridge. She held private meetings in the mornings, formal dinners in the evenings, and spent the hours in between moving through the corridors with her 2 senior aides trailing just behind her, speaking in the low and measured tones of someone who never said a single word without knowing in advance exactly what it was supposed to accomplish. She was pushing a resource partition treaty, a formal division of unclaimed mineral rights in the Outer Veth Belt, that would, on the surface, appear to be a fair and organized distribution of resources among all interested parties. But the details told a very different story. The partition was structured in a way that gave the largest and most militarily powerful species access to the richest and most accessible deposits while assigning the minor species, the ones with no warships, no armies, no political leverage of any kind, to sectors that were either nearly empty or so geologically unstable that mining them would cost far more than any of them could reasonably earn back. It was not a crime. Nothing in galactic law required a treaty to be genuinely fair, but it was the kind of move that only worked if the minor species either did not understand what was actually being done to them, or did not believe they had any real way to fight it. Sareth Vane had the votes, she had counted them twice, and she was not worried. She had, however, started to notice something small and slightly irritating at the edge of her otherwise clear political picture. A Dreth trade negotiator named Chorith, a serious and detail-focused creature who rarely said anything at social events that was not directly related to trade figures, had approached her at dinner on the second evening with a question that had an odd quality to it. "Hi, Envoy," Chura said carefully. "Are you aware that the Earth Observer predicted the outcome of the closed session this afternoon, including the Eurelian counteroffer figure, before the session even began?" Sareth Vane looked at him with her pale gold eyes. "He did what?" "He said it to his station aide this morning," Chura said. "I happened to be standing nearby in the corridor. The figure he gave was accurate to within 2 units. Sareth Vane was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that was almost a laugh. "He made a lucky guess," she said, and turned back to her dinner. But Churith did not look entirely satisfied with this answer, and she noticed that too. On the third day, a Eurelian security officer named Preth stopped TEV in a corridor and asked him something in a low and careful voice. TEV mentioned it to Vaughn later that afternoon. "He wanted to know how you knew the layout of the station's eastern wing," TEV said. "What did you tell him?" Vaughn asked. "I told him you walked through it once on the first day," TEV said. Vaughn nodded. "That is correct." TEV stared at him. "Commander, the eastern wing has over 400 rooms across 9 levels. I have worked on this station for 4 years and I still sometimes take a wrong turn in that section." Vaughn simply smiled and wrote something in his notebook, and TEV, for the third time in as many days, watched the pen move across the page and felt the quiet certainty growing stronger. That evening Sareth Vane passed Vaughn in a corridor near the main dining hall. She did not stop or slow her pace, but her golden eyes moved to the notebook as she went by. The way a person's eyes move to something they are trying to decide is worth their attention. She decided it was not, and she kept walking. But in her private chamber that night, while reviewing her vote counts for the following morning session, she found her mind drifting back to the image, the human in the outer ring, the paper notebook, the pen that never stopped moving, and she pushed the thought away and focused on her numbers. The numbers were solid. The treaty would pass. Nothing had changed. Back in his small assigned quarters near the outer docking corridor, Vaughn reviewed the pages he had filled over 3 full days: names, small facts, specific worries, the particular concerns of people that nobody else in this station had thought to ask about, and he began to see, laid out in his own plain handwriting, the clear shape of something that could matter. Not to him. He had no vote, no floor rights, no formal standing in this chamber at all. None of that had changed, and he had known it from the first moment he walked in. But the people whose names filled these pages had standing. They had legal rights they had never been taught how to use, and they had voices that had simply never been told they were worth raising. Vaughn closed the notebook, set down his pen, and looked at the ceiling of his small room for a long quiet moment. Then he picked the pen back up and wrote one more line before going to sleep. The morning of the resource partition vote arrived with the particular kind of stillness that fills a room just before something important happens. Delegates came in earlier than usual, speaking in quieter voices, moving to their seats with more deliberate purpose than any of the previous sessions had required. Sareth Vane entered the chamber at precisely the scheduled time, not a moment early and not a moment late, dressed in formal Velocian ceremonial robes that caught the light in shifting patterns of silver and deep blue. She looked, as she always did before a major vote, like a person who already knew the outcome and was simply present in the room to receive it. Vaughn was already in his outer-ring seat when she arrived. He gave her the same polite nod he had given her on the very first day. The one she had already learned meant nothing and bothered her slightly for precisely that reason, and she looked away and settled into her position at the inner ring. The chamber filled and the session was called to order by the conclave's senior moderator, a tall and ancient Mavari named Jiven who had presided over conclave sessions for longer than some of the younger species in the room had been traveling between stars. Jiven announced the formal agenda in a slow, resonant voice. The Resource Partition Treaty of the Outer Veth Belt was the first and primary item of the day, and the chamber settled into the particular focused silence that comes just before a vote. Sareth Vane stood and presented the treaty in precise and careful language. She outlined the resource distribution, cited the legal frameworks that supported the partition structure, acknowledged the stated interests of all involved parties, and concluded with the formal call for a vote, all in under 10 minutes, which was itself a kind of statement, the confidence of someone who sees no need for a long argument when the outcome is already decided. The voting process at the conclave worked outward from the inner ring, senior delegates first, then the middle tiers, then the outer ring where the minor species sat, and it proceeded exactly as expected through the first several rounds. The powerful species voted as they had agreed to vote in Sareth Vane's private meetings, in favor, without hesitation, without drama. Then the middle tier voted, mixed results, as she had anticipated, some in favor, some abstaining, a few opposing but without enough political weight behind them to change the outcome of anything. Sareth Vane watched the count with calm gold eyes. It was going exactly as planned, exactly as it always went, exactly as she had known it would from the moment she had drafted the first version of this treaty 4 months ago. Then the outer ring began to vote. Maravel of the Sen Collective rose from her seat. She was a small pale creature, quiet and easily overlooked, the kind of delegate who normally submitted written votes rather than standing to speak in open session, and she stood up straight and spoke in a clear and steady voice that carried further than anyone expected. She did not simply vote against the treaty. She lodged a formal procedural objection. She cited Conclave Charter Article 7, Section 3, a clause relating to the right of any registered species to request a full environmental and economic impact review before any resource treaty affecting their home sector could be finalized, and she presented a written objection in precise formal legal language that invoked this clause with complete and specific accuracy. The chamber stirred, a low wave of movement and whispered sound running through the rows like wind moving through tall grass. A procedural objection of that type did not kill a vote outright, but it placed the entire matter into a mandatory review cycle that could take months to complete, during which the treaty could not be enacted in any form. Sareth Vane's eyes narrowed just slightly, but before she could draw breath to respond, old Grath of the Heaven Compact rose slowly from his place in the outer ring. Grath had not stood to speak at a full open session in 11 years. Everyone in the chamber knew this because his long silence had become something of a quiet observation among the veteran delegates, and his rising now sent an immediate ripple of sharp attention through the room. He lodged a procedural objection of his own, different from Maravel's, specific to the Heaven Compact's legal standing under a completely separate charter clause, one that required documented proof of non-interference with sovereign economic zones before any outer belt partition could receive final approval. The chamber did not just stir now, it began to fracture at the edges, voices breaking through in sharp bursts before being quickly suppressed as people remembered they were still in formal session. Then Lissa Ven of the Orith Federation stood. She was visibly nervous, her hands gripping the edge of her desk, but her voice when she spoke was clear and did not waver. Then a delegate from the Keth Alliance stood, a species so minor that several senior delegates in the inner ring had to quietly ask their aides which species the Keth Alliance actually were. Then 2 more from the outer ring, then another, and every single one of them rose and delivered a formal procedural objection, and every objection was completely different from the last. Each one was tailored precisely to that specific species' individual legal rights and standing under conclave law. Each one targeted a different clause, exploited a different protection, activated a different mechanism, and each one was technically correct, cleanly worded, and formally valid enough that Senior Moderator Javen had no procedural option but to acknowledge every single one as it was submitted. 7 objections in total, from 7 different species, each one locking a separate legal mechanism into place, and when the last one was entered into the official record, the combined procedural effect was total and complete. The treaty could not pass today, could not pass this session, in fact, not without a full legal review that would consume the rest of the conclave cycle. The chamber erupted. Senior delegates who had been half settled in their seats through the outer ring votes were suddenly bolt upright and very much awake. Voices rose in a dozen languages simultaneously. The Dreth negotiators were clicking rapidly to one another. The Eurelians were pulling up data tablets with fast, sharp movements. 3 inner-ring delegates were speaking over each other in what sounded like one continuous noise. Sareth Vane stood at her position in the inner ring with both hands flat on her desk and her expression completely, entirely still, and that stillness was somehow more alarming to the people around her than any outburst would have been. Javen struck his staff against the floor and called for order, once, twice, 3 times, before the noise settled enough for formal proceedings to continue. And then every eye in that chamber, every delegate from every species, the powerful and the minor and everyone between, turned toward the outer ring. Not toward the 7 delegates who had risen and spoken. They looked past those 7, to the very last row, to the furthest and most distant seat at the outermost edge of the entire chamber. Vaughn was writing in his notebook. He looked up once, slowly and without any hurry, and he took in the full weight of the room's attention resting on him from every direction. Then he looked back down at his notebook and kept writing. Sareth Vane stared at him from across the full width of the chamber, and for the first time in a very long time, her pale gold eyes held something that was not calculation and not amusement and not the smooth, controlled certainty that had defined every moment of her political career. It was something closer to the expression a person gets when they realize they have been looking at a map upside down for a very long time and have only just now, in this exact moment, turned it the right way. Javen called a temporary recess and the chamber began to empty for a short break. Delegates clustered in urgent buzzing groups throughout the room and in the corridors outside, voices tight and fast, everyone speaking and almost no one listening. Near the entrance, young TV stood with his data tablets pressed against his chest and watched Commander Vaughn gather his things and rise calmly from his outer ring seat. And the feeling TV had carried since the very first day, quiet and persistent and hard to fully name, came back now stronger and clearer than it had ever been, like something that had always been true finally becoming fully visible in the light. The human had not said a single word on the chamber floor today, had not voted, had not objected, had not formally participated in any part of what had just happened. But 7 voices had spoken where there had only ever been silence before, and somehow, in 3 days, with a paper notebook and a plain pen, every single one of them had known exactly what to say. Sareth Vane did not go to the social corridors during the recess. She went to one of the conclave's private meeting rooms, small, grey-walled, and deliberately plain, the kind of room designed to have no political symbolism in its furniture or its light, and she told her 2 senior aides to wait outside and to make sure nobody else came in. Then she sent a message to Commander Elias Vaughn through TV, asking him to come. She did not phrase it as a request. Vaughn arrived without hurrying. He knocked twice on the open door, which was a human custom that Sareth Vane found briefly strange, since the door was already standing open, and stepped inside with his notebook under his arm and the same untroubled expression he had worn in the chamber every day since he arrived. Sareth Vane stood at the far end of the small room with her arms crossed. She was still in her formal ceremonial robes and she still had the bearing of the most powerful person in any room she occupied, but something in her posture was different from how she had looked standing at the inner ring podium. She looked like a person who was trying very hard to understand something and did not particularly enjoy the unfamiliar feeling of not being able to. "Was that you?" she said, not loudly, not with the theatrical brightness she had used in the chamber on the first day, but in a flat and direct voice that made it clear she was entirely done performing. "Was what me?" Vaughn said, and he settled into a chair across from her without waiting to be invited to sit, which she also noticed. 7 outering species, 7 separate procedural objections, each one precisely correct in its legal language, each one targeting a different clause of conclave charter law, she said. Minor species who have never once in their entire conclave membership used procedural objection for anything. Species whose names most senior delegates cannot recall without checking a reference list. And they each stood up and delivered objections so technically complete that Javen had no choice but to enter every single one of them into the official record. "Was that you?" Vaughn looked at her steadily. "I did not file any objections," he said. "I have no floor rights. Observer status does not permit it." "That is not what I asked," she said. Vaughn was quiet for a moment, just a moment, and then he said, "I had some conversations." Sareth Vane stared at him. "You had some conversations," she repeated, very slowly, in the measured tone of someone making absolutely certain they have heard a set of words correctly before they respond to them. "Yes," Vaughn said. "I talked to people. I listened to what they were worried about, and I explained some things about conclave charter law that they may not have been fully aware of, things that were already their rights, that already existed in the documents their species signed when they first joined the conclave. I did not give them anything that was not already completely and entirely theirs." Sareth Vane was quiet for several seconds, and it was the kind of quiet that is not empty at all but absolutely full of very fast thinking. "You did all of that in 3 days, she said finally, with a paper notebook. "The notebook helps me remember details," Vaughn said. "Names, specific concerns, the particular words that matter to different people in different situations. It is much easier to listen well when you write things down." "You are not what I thought you were," Sareth Vane said, and it came out sounding less like a compliment and more like something she was working out for herself, out loud, in real time. "Most people who are laughed at are not what the people doing the laughing thought they were," Vaughn said, and there was no sharpness in it, no edge, no attempt to wound. It was just a plain and simple statement, offered the way a person states a fact they have known for a long time. Sareth Vane sat down across from him, and this was notable because she almost never sat during a conversation she was trying to control, and she looked at him with a careful and measuring expression, as though she was revising a calculation and needed to be sure the new numbers were right before she accepted them. "What are you people?" she said, not with contempt, not with amusement, not with anything except the plain tone of someone asking a genuine question they had genuinely not thought to ask before. Vaughn thought about this for a moment, and then he said, "We are a species that spent a very long time hurting each other, and because of that we became deeply interested in understanding why it happens, why certain people get ignored, why certain voices go unheard, what makes one group of people decide that another group of people does not matter as much as they do." He set his notebook on the table between them and opened it to a page near the middle. "Would you like to see?" he said. Sareth Vane looked at the open page. It was covered in small, neat handwriting, names and notes and small details written in clear, plain rows, and near the top of one column she saw two words that stopped her completely. Her own name, and next to it, in neat plain letters, the name of one of her own junior aides, a young Velocian named Rath who had been assigned to her diplomatic staff 3 months ago and who she had not thought about in any specific way since the day the assignment was processed, and next to Rath's name, a small note. Asterisk wants to study hydroengineering, afraid to ask for reassignment asterisk. Sareth Vane looked up from the page. "How do you know that?" she said, and this time there was something new in her voice, something quieter and less defended than anything she had allowed herself to sound like since she was a very young delegate learning her first treaty. "I asked Rath how they were finding life on the station," Vaughn said. "On the second day, in the eastern corridor near the technical library, they mentioned it in the way people mention things they do not actually expect anyone to hear or remember." Sareth Vane said nothing. "You have 7 junior staff members on this mission," Vaughn said. "I know the name of every one of them. I know one small true thing about each of them that they told me themselves, because I asked and then I actually paid attention to the answer." He paused, and then he said the thing that landed in that small grey room the way a stone drops into perfectly still water. "You laughed at the paper and the pen, but you never once asked why a species that had already crossed the stars still carries them." Sareth Vane sat very still. "We carry them because every person is worth remembering," Vaughn said. "Every conversation is worth having. Every small and overlooked detail about another living being matters. We learned this the hard way, over a very long and very painful history that we have spent a great deal of effort studying so we would not repeat it, and that lesson traveled with us when we came out here into the galaxy." The room was completely quiet around them both. "The 7 delegates who stood today were not doing me a favor," Vaughn said. "They were protecting themselves, using rights they already had, and they were able to do it because for 3 days someone sat with them and told them plainly that what they needed mattered and that they had every right in the world to need it." He closed the notebook. "That is what we are," he said. "We are the species that sits with people. We have always been the species that sits with people, and we will keep being that species no matter how far from home we travel." The silence after he stopped speaking was long and complete. Sareth Vane looked at the closed notebook on the table between them. Then she looked at the plain and unremarkable face of the man sitting across from her, the man she had laughed at in front of 47 species, and she felt something shift inside her chest that she could not immediately name and did not try to. She stood after a long moment and walked to the door, and just before she stepped out she stopped with her back still toward him. "The assembly tomorrow morning," she said. "Be in your seat early." Then she walked out, and Vaughn sat alone in the small grey room for a quiet moment before he opened his notebook again and added one more line to the page. That evening the station felt different. Not in any way that showed up on the environmental monitors or in any official record. The temperature and the air pressure and the corridor lighting were exactly what they always were. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of Narveth the way a season shifts, not all at once but suddenly and completely noticeable the moment you looked up and paid attention. Delegates who had not spoken to the outering species at any point in the 3 days since arrival were now finding small reasons to pass through the corridors where those species gathered for their evening meals. Some stopped and nodded, some made brief introductions. One inner-ring delegate sat down at a minor species table and stayed there for the better part of an hour. Chorith, the Dreth trade negotiator, spent a full hour in quiet, focused conversation with Maravel of the Sen Collective and left the dining hall looking genuinely thoughtful in a way his colleagues said they had not seen from him in years. Nobody was entirely sure how to talk about what had happened yet, but everybody in that station could feel that something had changed, and they could all feel without being told that it was connected in some way to the quiet human who still sat in the outer ring every session with a worn notebook and a plain pen and a way of looking at people that made them feel, without quite understanding why, that he was actually seeing them. The following morning Sareth Vane requested an emergency full assembly. The conclave chamber filled quickly with the charged and crackling energy of a room packed with political experts who know that something unexpected is about to happen but cannot yet determine what it is. Delegates leaned toward their neighbors in low urgent conversation. Aides checked data tablets with fast, sharp movements, and the senior moderator Javen sat at the center podium with his ancient Mavari face showing absolutely no expression at all. Vaughn arrived early, as he always did, and took his seat in the outer ring. Tivy sat nearby in the aide position and quietly watched the room fill with the same wide silver eyes he had used to watch it every morning for 4 years, but seeing it today in a way that felt entirely new. Sareth Vane walked to the center podium. No aide at her side today, no data tablet in her hand, no prepared document laid out in front of her to read from, just herself, standing at the exact center of the chamber where she had stood and presided and maneuvered for 30 years. She looked around the room slowly, taking in every face, every species, the inner rings and the middle tiers and the long curved outer row, and when she spoke her voice was clear and carried easily to every corner of the chamber without any amplification. "I am withdrawing the Outer Veth Belt Resource Partition Treaty," she said. The room absorbed this in a single beat of absolute and total silence. Then it erupted, voices in every language, creatures half rising from their seats, senior delegates turning to their neighbors with expressions that range from outright shock to open confusion to the rapid and visible recalculation of political people who are very quickly updating their understanding of a situation. Sareth Vane waited. She did not move, did not raise a hand for quiet, did not signal her aides. She simply stood at the center podium and let the reaction run its full course, and after a long wave of noise the chamber settled enough for her to continue. "I am withdrawing it, and I am replacing it with a proposal for a full and genuinely equitable review of all Outer Belt resource rights, to be conducted with the real and equal participation of every species holding conclave membership, including every species in the Outer Ring," she said, "every species, regardless of military standing, economic strength, or how many sessions they have been attending this chamber." More noise, but different now, some of it disbelieving, some of it cautious, some of it carrying the particular bright sound of genuine surprise from people who had stopped expecting to be surprised. "I am also making a formal motion," Sareth Vane continued, waiting for the chamber to settle once more, "under Article 2, Section 1 of the Conclave Founding Charter, the clause which states that full membership shall be granted to any species that demonstrates a fundamental and working understanding of the Conclave's core and founding purpose, the protection and fair representation of all species, not only the ones with the most power behind them." She paused, and the chamber was quiet now, fully and completely and utterly quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when a room full of very intelligent beings all arrive at exactly the same realization at exactly the same moment. "I am formally nominating humanity for full voting membership in the Interstellar Conclave of Narveth," she said, and she delivered it in a flat and certain voice, the voice of a person who has made a decision with her whole mind and means every word of it completely. The silence held for 3 full seconds after her last word. Then Maravel of the Sen Collective stood, small and pale and clear-voiced, and seconded the motion without ceremony or speech, simply stood and stated her agreement and sat back down. Then Old Grath of the Heaven Compact stood, slowly, as he always did everything, and added his second in his low and steady voice. Then Lissaven of the Orith Federation, then the delegate from the Keth Alliance, then 3 voices from the middle tiers, then 2 from the inner ring, and then, in a moment that no political analyst present had any previous experience or existing model to explain, the seconds came from all directions at once, overlapping and uncoordinated and completely unrehearsed, rising from the outer ring and the middle tiers and the inner circle all together in a way that sounded less like a vote, and more like a room full of people saying something they had all been thinking and had only now found permission to say out loud. Jiven called the formal vote and the result was unanimous. All 47 species, every single member of the Interstellar Conclave of Narveth, voted to grant humanity full voting membership. Jiven announced the result in his slow and resonant voice and struck his ancient ceremonial staff against the chamber floor 3 times, the traditional signal reserved only for decisions of historic significance, and the sound rang out through the chamber and then faded into a silence that felt nothing at all like the silence before. This silence felt like open space after something important has finally and correctly been said, clean and wide and full of the particular kind of possibility that only exists after something real has changed. Sareth Vane stepped back from the center podium and stood still for a moment, and then she walked. She walked through the chamber as it slowly filled with conversation and movement around her, delegates rising, turning to one another, voices climbing into the warm, excited register of people who know they are going to be telling this story for a long time, and she crossed the full width of the chamber floor without stopping until she reached the outermost row. She stopped at Vaughn's seat. He looked up at her, the same calm face, the same steady and unhurried eyes. She did not apologize. No words were offered and no explanation was given. She simply reached into the front of her ceremonial robe and drew out a long, slender pen. It was ancient Velocian craftsmanship, deep blue metal etched with a fine pattern worn nearly smooth from long and constant use, the kind of object that had passed through many hands over many years and quietly carried all of that with it in the weight and feel of it. She set it on his desk. Then she turned and walked away without looking back. Vaughn looked at the pen for a long moment. Then he picked it up and turned it once slowly in his fingers and uncapped it. The tip was fine and perfectly precise, better than his old pen in every way that could be measured, and he set it to the page and kept writing. TV, standing a few feet away with his data tablets loose in his hands for the first time all morning, watched this and felt the feeling from the very first day return one final time. But it was not strange anymore, and it was not hard to name. It was something very simple and very clear. It was the feeling of watching a person do exactly what they had always been going to do, in exactly the way they had always been going to do it, regardless of what anyone around them had said or done or thought. Commander Elias Vaughn, Earth's first and only representative to the interstellar conclave of Narveth, had crossed the distance between stars with a worn paper notebook and a plain pen. He had been given the last seat in the last row of the outermost ring. He had been laughed at in front of 47 species by the most powerful diplomat in the galaxy. And then he had changed everything, not with a weapon, not with a warship, not with money or threats or centuries of political experience, but by doing the one thing that turned out to be rarer in all the wide and ancient galaxy than faster-than-light travel or the colonization of new worlds. He had paid attention. He had listened. He had remembered. TV looked at the open notebook one final time, and from where he was standing now he could just make out the last line written on the page, the new ink still slightly dark against the paper, written in the clean and unhurried hand of a man who had never once stopped believing it was true. It said this: Asterisk, they were always going to be okay. They just needed someone to sit with them, asterisk.